there's a difference between just going and solving the actual problem they want versus understanding that you're taking an opinion against that, which is where innovation actually happens.
Welcome to UpTech Report. This is our Founder's Journey series. UpTech Report is sponsored by TerraLeap. Learn how to leverage the power of video at terraleap.io. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my guest, again, Greg Segall, who's based in Boston, Massachusetts. He's the CEO and founder of Alyce. Now, this is part 2, so definitely go back and listen to part 1, where we talk more about their AI-powered B2B gifting platform, where they're trying to redefine direct mail, swag, and gifting with a scalable, hyper-personalized approach to account-based marketing. And actually, right at the end of our interview, I loved what Greg said. He's trying to scale authenticity. Like, wow. So definitely go back and listen to that. But Greg, I'm excited in this episode is to hear more about your journey. I mean, this didn't start yesterday. It was 5-6 years ago, 2015.
5 years ago.
5 years, okay.
5 years ago, yeah.
And I think I just saw a report on your site that you guys just raised a Series B. Is that correct?
Yep.
So lots of exciting things have been happening, but take me back, like all the way back before Alyce. What was the journey? How did you get to where you are?
You want me to go back to college?
Let's go back. Let's go back.
Yeah, so I think, I started off as an art major actually at college, and I'll tell you why this is important as I sort of go through this. And I always say this, that I basically drew, sculpted, and painted a bunch of naked people for about 3 years, which is sort of my entry to the art world. But I also fell in love with computer science my sophomore year, and I was always a big computer geek, even through middle school and and before that as well. And it's sort of like during the 90s, and not to date myself, but there you go. But I started my first company when I was 19. It was an agency. We were focused very much on the e-commerce space as time went on. So we became one of the largest e-commerce agencies around, and we focused on a platform in the early days called Magento, which was just recently bought by Adobe. Maybe it was about a year and a half ago for $1.5 billion. And I remember when it was just 8 of them, and Roy and Yoav, who started that, and I were talking. We're both basically starting our companies up and trying to figure out what's next. And grew that company, sold that business in the end of 2012, stayed on for a couple more years, and then was looking for what to do next.
This is One Pika, right?
One Pika. There you go. So I'm going to tell you why I named it Alyce, which is, you should ask me that because you literally just did exactly why I'm very calculated with names. So thank you very much, Alex. So One Pika, O-N-E space P-I-C-A. Everyone's like, One Pika. I'm like, we're not Pikachu. Like, come on. This is ridiculous. So, the next business, so I played around with a bunch of different, startup ideas after selling my first company. And I came to this realization that, first of all, I was having my daughter. And, when my wife is pregnant, you start to understand that the world is very different. And when your daughter's born, it takes you from a very the world revolves around you to all of a sudden now the world revolves around this little nugget that you have, that's there. And the love that you have for this little baby is more than you'd ever imagine, anything ever in the world. And, it just made me believe the last company I started was great. Loved it. The employees, the story, everything that was there, but it wasn't an impactful business. It wasn't something where the root and the purpose of the business was actually set from the second that the business was actually, built. So I remember I have the whiteboard originally. I actually did an onboarding for our new class, for this last couple of weeks today that joined up with Alyce. And, I showed them and I was like, look, there was 3 pillars of giving that were listed on the beginning first whiteboard when I was like, what's the business model that we want to create as an organization? And what I recognized was when I started my first business at 19, I wasn't very intentional about what are the values of the business? What are we trying to do? What's the vision? What do we see as what's our vision of the future, and how are we actually making sure that that's instantiated in the DNA of the business? And I wrote the 3 pillars of giving, and the 3 pillars of giving were, number 1, how do you make giving a truly authentic experience in B2B, which is super wrought with fakeness right now. And just it's all surface level, right? And it's squish balls and, crappy vests and, all the other stuff that people are doing, and golf events. I don't golf, right? Steak events. I don't eat steak, just things that are not relevant to me, as you go, and end up actually hurting the relationship more than helping it. So the first pillar of giving was, how do you give to people to make it an authentic connection between people, that investment. The second pillar of giving was, how do we give back to those in need? So how does it that the business model, I was very enamored, always enamored, even back in my e-commerce days with like Tom's, shoes, right? And I know the founders and, was working with them, in the early days of Tom's, and, their one for one mentality or model. And then Warby Parker did a fairly similar thing, with their model as well. And I started with, knew them when they first started off as well. And it was just very interesting just to think about, well, how does the business model fit that, where it's just about giving back? And that's where the donation model came into Alyce, and where when you give a gift, the person has the opportunity to be able to donate to a charity of their choice, the value to a charity of their choice. The third pillar of giving was, how do you give back to the planet? So everything was rooted in sustainability. If you look at corporate spend in terms of, events and swag and gifts and everything that sort of plays into that, meals, trips, tickets, all those things, so much of it goes in the trash. So much of it is wasted at the end of the day, which has a huge effect on the world. And so sustainability and that, a power to give back to the planet was like a core tenet of that. So anyone that's joining up with Alyce understands those three pillars of giving, and understands that that is really like the driving factor, is that this is a double bottom line business. It's about being able to have that huge impact on the business that's there. So I'll stop there and talk much more about it.
Right from with that manifesto when you started the organization.
Yeah, because it was this like life-changing moment when you have your daughter, in that specific case, which also affected some other things I'm happy to talk about too, in terms of like, I have this very like passion project around like, how do you empower women and minorities in business, especially in tech, which is like so raw with like, the white dude syndrome, that we have, right?
I like that, the white dude syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it'll be named something else, whatever. But like, that's just the reality of it. And, it fundamentally changes your perspective on not only the world, and understanding like you're now caring for this being, for the next 18 years until they go off, hopefully, right? Into the world. And you just want to make that person's life as good as humanly possible. But that's only going to happen if you actually make the world around her and us, that much more powerful. And that was something I was missing in my first business that I really feel like was like a real big driver for this one, was something that had to do with giving back, was a big piece of it.
So help me understand a little bit more about kind of the steps here on that journey. So you had one pica.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
By the way, pica is also an eating disorder. So by me naming a company at 19, like, you should have slapped me across the side of the head, because it was horrible. Yeah. Not only could nobody say it, it was supposed to be an ironic name because a pica was a print measurement. I also found out about a year into it that it was a eating disorder, and I'm like, I guess we're living with that, like, cool.
2020 hindsight, you're like, yeah, okay, well, next time we'll do differently. So 12 years around there, you were in that, but then you what was the timeline here of your daughter? And then you're like, let's start it, because I see it's 2015 that you began, is that right?
Yeah.
Did you like just bootstrap at the beginning? Did you already like, well, let's get some funding? What was that journey step?
So it was bootstrapped for the first year of the business. So it was myself and a couple of interns, sort of starting to build this off, and one engineer that I was working with. So again, I'm a computer science guy, so I'm an engineer myself. So basically, we actually built the first version of Alyce, and I'll take you a step back in a second here, but we built that in 6 weeks, and that started on October 31st of 2015. We launched on December, I think it was 14th or 15th, of 2015, with like most of the functionality and like some semblance of working order there, right? The experience was there and all that stuff was there. Leading up to that, which is a big difference in terms of how I started this company versus the previous one, was that I did a lot of market research, like literally a month's worth of market research on the gifting space. And I'm not going to go into the story, but like, I had started with a bunch of ideas, was testing them out with different friends, and then always came back to the gifts, swag, all the spend in corporations. And when I talked to 513 companies across from October 1st until October 31st, when I actually 513 companies. I still have the list because I went back to that. And it was like 3 to 4, 5 companies, 6 companies a day, just having these half an hour, 45-minute conversations of friends in the spaces, and asking them what the opportunity was. And you start to recognize that there was so much opportunity in the space and so much money, hundreds of billions of dollars a year being spent across all those different categories. So I was like, all right, there's something big here. And then the behavior and the stuff that they kept asking was like, well, I never send the right thing. I don't know what to send. What's the right time to send this? The process is a pain in the neck. I always just end up falling back on the holidays, blah, blah, blah. Like, and then you get into like the questions about how do you invest into those relationships? Oh, well, we do, these events and blah, blah, blah. It was like, it kept going on and on and on, where you're just like, wow, there is so many problems to solve here. And how do you do that? And then the other big theme of that was, well, how do you tie it back to ROI? They're like, we're spending more money on our gift swag events than we're spending on our CRM map, marketing automation platforms and everything combined. So you're like, okay, that's super interesting. And then you got to, in that research, I also got to the fundamentals, because I would always ask them, well, what's the experience that you would want? And that's when you recognize everybody said the same thing. Well, they send me stuff I don't really care about. I have my drawer full of crap at home, that I have, or I bring it to my kids and then they throw it out, and we throw it out, a year later because it's stuck at the bottom of their toy closet or whatever it is. So all of that was sort of the culmination, around this, around the concept around that. And again, it all stemmed from those 3 pillars of giving, as I mentioned before. So it went from that. We built the platform in 6 weeks, launched it, had 20 customers like almost instantaneously. We did it in like an alpha. And then there was the magic moment happened there, because we had this I had this hypothesis that if people used Alyce and they sent gifts, they're going through a digital experience. Now they're going to experience Alyce, and now there's a viral effect built into the business. Well, that just took off. So all of a sudden, the first 5 people that sent their gifts during the holiday season, leading up to Christmas, all of a sudden, like 5 more people said, hey, how do we get access to Alyce so we can send off gifts to our employees, or blah, 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 or whatever it was. And then that was where I was like, bing, there's the magic, the magical idea. How do we harness that, and how do we use that and leverage that as a big thing? And every bigger brand that started using Alyce gave us more brand exposure, gave us more trust in the space. And then that helped to obviously build us into where we were.
And you had made a mention in our last discussion here that you're focused on mid-market enterprise. When you began, you probably were taking almost any business at the beginning.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you just slowly worked your way up until you got into the enterprise organizations. Is that right?
The pro and the con of Alyce, especially in a space like this, is that every company, every department in every company, every team in every company, every person in every company can use Alyce for some reason, for some way, which is different than like having an analytics platform where you're like, well, I'm going to go in and target this specific, persona and sell into this and blah, 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 whatever it is. And in this specific case, it was, well, where do you focus? So the first thing was like, for the first year, just let's figure out where the opportunity is. We had some hypotheses around that. So we ended up doing actually a lot on the employee side of things, but start to realize that it's considered a nice to have, not a necessity, because as soon as like it's been brought into the heightened area right now, because all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my God, everyone's remote. We got to invest in our people. But as soon as people start going back to hybrid and some of these other things, you're going to realize that there's going to be some of a swell down there. So what I said is I made a conscious decision, sort of going into the 2017-ish timeframe, sort of towards the end there, be like, we have a lot of companies using this on the sales and marketing side. How do we just focus on that? So we ended up cutting out almost 400, 500 customers, out of that. And it's almost starting with like a dozen and building the business back up as a SaaS platform focused on sales and marketing, because it was all about that like program they're subscribing to, not just, oh, I'm going to send some gifts off, for some random thing. And that's basically it.
So just a quick clarification. At the beginning, it wasn't SaaS that people were just sending gifts whenever they thought of it.
Nope. And we made a transaction margin. Yeah.
Transactional.
Because again, go back to my e-commerce roots. The unfair advantage was I knew all of the Warby Parkers and the Grommets and all these other companies, and I just went to them and I was like, I'm going to hand you free customers. Just give me a margin off of that, and then it was free for anyone to use the platform and just come on. But it also caused episodic usage, not programmatic usage, because they're actually subscribing to the Alyce approach. That was the big breakthrough that we had in 2017, which led us to have raising our seed rounds, because we started to show some of that traction around how we were fundamentally approaching the business there.
So it was what year did the seed round come in? Is that 2017 when you made?
So we did an angel round in 2016.
Okay.
We did 2 tranches in that. So we did one in October-ish of 2016, and then another one in February. So those were like a small rounds. It was like $500,000 total between those 2. And then we raised $5.4 million in September, going into October of 2017. So it was almost a year later after we actually had that. But by that point, we'd sort of learned a lot of the stuff that was happening there, and kind of like built a much tighter hypothesis around what's the fundamental thing we're actually trying to solve here, knowing that it's a huge industry and whatnot.
Would you agree or recommend the approach you took of kind of bootstrapping and getting to that point before you brought in the funding versus bringing it right at the beginning?
100%. I mean, I advise a lot of women-owned and minority-owned businesses right now, and startups right now, and I tell them the same thing. I'm like, because there's one fundamental concept behind it. Every dollar in is a piece of equity out. So even when you're spending capital, like when I think about it, my first business was bootstrapped, right? So I'm biased on this anyway, right? Because there's different ways of growing a business, right? You can just raise tons of capital and figure things out, which people do. They figure out businesses, and there's an unfair advantage to having some capital, in some of those cases. But a lot of times it also causes unfocused approaches to a market, which means you basically take like a checkbox strategy instead of a strategy around like, well, what is it that you're actually trying to solve for in those specific cases. So get back to the funding, the deeper and farther you can go by showing traction, the less of the company you're going to give away, and also the higher the value of the business is at that specific point, especially if you can be testing out very focused hypotheses from the get-go, which again I didn't do in an agency. And this business was much more concerted and intentional in terms of how I was thinking about those elements, and just got more intentional as time went on because we just learned more. You're like a learning machine, constantly evolving and constantly learning more as you go.
If you had to think back to successful tactics that work to help you focus on those learning mechanisms, what tactics did you find and would recommend to others?
Talk to customers, right? I think I'll be honest, like my business before Alyce, it was called CFit, another horrible name, which is fine. Which again goes to the intentionality of Alyce, why it was picked, which I can go into later if you're interested. But the fundamentals of that was that I didn't do enough user research. We built on a cool concept, but it was like, it wasn't focused enough in terms of what's the actual pain point that you're solving for. Like you have to have empathy for what your customer is actually going through in order to truly be able to solve that problem. Now, there's a difference between just going and solving the actual problem they want versus understanding that you're taking an opinion against that, which is where innovation actually happens, right?
Break that down for me.
So if you go in and you're saying, okay, I need to solve for, sending more emails. The problem is, okay, I'm building a system so you can actually just spam people more, but you're not taking an understanding as to like, what's the vision of the business. So you have to be understanding as to like, what's the vision for the business? What's the DNA of the values of the business, which forms the core of the people and your approach and your ability to adhere to those values of the business, which should link up directly to the vision, right? And your vision of the future. And then you're actually building the business, against that capacity, and you're building hypotheses which have those as the undertones of how you're actually driving the business forward as you go there too. The problem with too many companies is they come in and say, I'm going to solve this little problem here. And again, there's many ways to skin a cat, right? You can go into so many different ways of doing this, but the more intentional you are around this, the easier it is for you to actually have control over what those hypotheses are, and then be able to test and know whether you're actually moving in the right direction or not with those specific places. So any of these companies, the companies I'm advising, I'm always challenging back and saying, what's the actual problem that you're trying to solve right now? What's the vision? Where are you on the journey? What's the stepping stone? What's the next stepping stone? And if you can't articulate what that next stepping stone is, then you've got problems. And you can't articulate the previous stepping stones that got you there and start to tie a thread through that. That's it. Again, you're angel rounds in the beginning, like in your nascent stage, like you're just trying to figure out anything, right? But you have to have a focused hypothesis, at least to test against. Otherwise, you're just like you're shotgunning things all over the place, and you're not actually like building towards something. The whole purpose of a hypothesis is either to be right or wrong, and then be able to take the next route. And you've got to be systematic on that versus this like throw spaghetti at the wall type of a thing and hope something sticks, as you go.
It sounds like you're taking the past experience of not doing that hypothesis approach and really tying back to the customer. You decided to be this very intentional with Alyce. Obviously, you can't do it by yourself. You've built a team, but help me understand, like, at what point and stage were you leading the charge every step of the way? What was the most important first major hire that you made that really helped you scale?
So I'll say this is a high-level theme. Again, something I always say when I'm advising companies is that the job of a CEO is to put themselves out of a job. every stage of the business. And that's something that's hard to learn, something I did a horrible job in my first company at, and something that took me some time to actually like tell that advice to people and then actually realize I have to take my own advice, in terms of that. So you have to understand that your role is to figure out how do you build scale inside the organization with people that are smarter than you, that bring other perspectives and other experiences to the business, right? There's a whole nother segment we can go down in terms of like diversity of perspectives and just diversity of people and backgrounds and things like that. But focusing on like the people that we brought in, I had two key hires in the beginning stages of the business that we brought in. One is Tori, who's still with the business. The other one was a guy named Ryan, who we're still friends with, and sort of led the initial customer success charges that were there during those like very early nascent stages, that were there as well. And those were the two that stayed with the business specifically through the first 2 to 2.5 years. That really helped shape a lot of the stuff because we were just in this constant learning, experience motion that was there as we went. And they started building the teams around that and starting to build in more pieces as the stages of the business, continue to go on. So that was sort of the first stage. And then as the business got to like the seed stage, all of a sudden the executive team broadened and you started to have more folks that started to come into the business, that were, instrumental, like, our head of customer success, Sean, and, Mike, who's our, head of sales, and like these folks that started to bring much more experience around being in situations at higher scale. What you want to do, like a business goes through an inflection point, usually every about 1.5 to 2 years, sometimes faster than that, sometimes it's a year, in there. And you have to understand that you've got to align the right experience and people around you to be accountable for the things that you're going to be able to do to scale. And you don't want to be guessing at that. But you also need to have, again, going back to diversities, you also have to be willing to take chances on certain people and be able to invest in those specific people, but also surround them with the right types of experience that's there. And it's a balance of that. You have too many experienced people, you have too many habits that are counterbalancing each other that are there. But you do have to understand that like as the stages go on, you're building kind of a layered cake of accountability structure and making sure that that's being, again, rooted in the DNA in the values of the business. Then you're on target there.
What would you say is one of your biggest lessons learned or insights from going from a service business of an agency to a SaaS model? What are some of the biggest lessons learned there?
First lesson was told to me by one of my favorite investors in the early days. It's still one of my favorite investors, Eric Paley, who's in Founder Collective. And I remember sitting down with him in his office, and this was right after we raised the seed round. And he challenged me with two things. And he said, okay, the first thing is this. He goes, you're big, because I asked him, I was like, I'm always trying to ask questions like, what do you see as the biggest weakness? So just because I like to have the data points to understand like what things I'm doing well and not doing well. And he said, your number one problem is that you're an agency CEO from the core. There's a big difference between being an agency CEO versus a product-based CEO. Now, again, this is 3.5 years ago. And he said, an agency CEO's job is to say yes. A product CEO's job is to say no. And it didn't sink in really what that meant until probably about a year later, when I started to understand what that meant. And again, definitely more focused, definitely more intentional, definitely willing to say no, but I still have the agency habit of saying, well, why can't we do it all? Like what's stopping us? Which is good in a way because it challenges, linear thinking in many cases, or binary thinking in a lot of cases. Again, my art background, sort of some of that creativity side of things is like, there's always a way to do something more creative and think scrappily around how you actually solve these problems. And that's also a problem with cash, is like you can get complacency built around that too, right? And that's a big thing I'm trying to instill in the business right now, is like you still got to be like, cost conscious around things, but in being able to invest heavier in hypotheses that we know are actually working and we know fit into the vision and the operationalness of the business that we're trying to move forward here too. So that was one piece of advice, right? That, agency CEOs say yes and no. The other one goes back to what I just talked about, which was he challenged me. He goes, okay, just raise $5 million. He goes, why are you not spending $5 million next month? And I was like, what? Like it came out of sort of left field. And I'm like, I joke about this with him all the time, by the way. So, and I'm like, what? Like, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, you just go spend $5 million next month. Why don't you just go do it and blow this company up? Like, what would you do? The point of it was to say, if you went and spent the money right now, you don't have confidence in where that money is actually being placed. So before you go spending the money, make sure you have the right confidence level in terms of where you're going to be spending the money, where that hypothesis is allowing you to say, yes, let's double down. And you're starting to get a lot of yeses in a row instead of this like, 101010, and you're constantly failing, and you're kind of like in this like teetering phase where you're just burning cash to burn cash. And again, having advised a lot of companies, even including Alyce, you have to balance that, because there are some things where cash allows you to test multiple hypotheses at the same time. So you have to understand, like, it is a burning cash business to get to the place that you need to be there. But there's a difference in terms of just go throw $1 billion quadrillion at something and hope it sticks, and then build no unit economics into the business, versus you actually building, consistency and intentionality around how you're actually showing, sustainable growth as you're building the business.
As a leader, how do you organize your own thoughts and day and process to be able to stay on top of it and make sure you are following all those proper hypotheses and not going down side tracks and not getting lost in the minutia?
I mean, that's hard. I mean, it's much easier when you're a 5-person company, 10-person company, 20-person company, right from the beginning, that's there, because you're in every conversation, or most conversations. We're in the same room, in most of those cases. I mean, for us, we were actually a distributed team almost from day one, there, because we had some people in Russia, we had some people in the US, we had some people in the Philippines, we had, folks in all different places that were there. And so it was always like, how do we bring everybody together? But you can have that conversation daily. We did a daily stand-up for the first 2 years of the business, where even as it got to 20, 25 people, every morning at 9 o'clock, everybody stood around for 15 minutes and we just talked about learnings in the business across the board. And it was a really cool way for everyone to be like, what are we hearing? What are we doing? What do we need to focus in on? And it was like a quick prioritization across the business, and like a unifying, moment around the business. As a business grows, you have to be very intentional with the constructs and the frameworks you put into the business to be able to communicate that across the business, so everybody understands and has a very tight understanding as to like what's their role in solving the bigger things for the business. Now, we are not perfect at this by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, we have a major initiative going on right now about how you build alignment in terms of this, because you can very quickly get unfocused without having that alignment in terms of what are we actually trying to do, in the world and in the business, especially where we've gotten to as a business as a whole, and sort of our place in the market as well.
You're at like how many team members now?
170 or so.
170. So going from obviously 20 people and stand up, no problem, to 170, that's just not possible anymore. Everybody
I mean, as soon as there's different inflection point. I learned from my first business, right? That was like at 10 people. Sort of one of my friends told me the law of like nines, or laws of threes and nines. It was like 9, 27, blah blah blah, whatever goes from there, and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But really, it's like you have your 10, your 25, your 50, your 150, or 100, 150. There's like these inflection points where you just have to keep reassessing those frameworks to keep everybody in line with what are you trying to drive towards. The other thing that's really important there too is, how do you drive that with an air of simplicity? It's very, very easy to get unfocused if you're not actually driving towards a very simple mission and a very simple vision in terms of how people are going there. And again, ours is a very far-reaching vision. Like, we know what we're trying to do, and there's 17 different ways till Sunday to get to that vision. So it's important to actually keep rebaselining the business, because also the market's changing constantly, the competitive landscape, which is great for us. Honestly, I love, like, you have to seeing competitors in a space is actually, first of all, it's a way for you to drive yourself, right? In terms of continue to innovate, but it also shows that the space is humongous. And that again, like in our space, we can have $5 billion, but again, to go back to hundreds of billions of dollars in the industry, like there could be $5 billion businesses that come out of the space. Like it's just reasonable. Is what's the approach that works in terms of different ways, as things go on there.
I love your mentality of how you approach the problem and willing to grow. Last question to just kind of wrap up our time together. Looking forward, what kind of tech predictions do you make? Because I know you're both art and computer science. You love technology itself, but what tech predictions would you make in the next year or two, near term and long term, 5-10 years?
So the first thing I talk geek out with a lot of my friends is that we're going to move from this era of automating quantity, and automating the like activities, to automating intelligence. And people have to understand that there's going to be this like 5-year journey that people are going to get to, where it's going to be a lot more about, like, you're not going to have to think as much, but it's going to allow you to focus on a lot more of the activities and make them a lot more valuable as time goes on. there's a lot of work that has to be done in there, right? And there's a lot of things, especially as you look at like, we spend a lot of time in like the data privacy world, which, even look at like Google and like the whole cookies situation stuff that's happening right now, as well. Like and even like Facebook and Apple, always like following that story as well, very closely, is like anything, markets can shift and change at all different cases, which changes behavior in the space. And then you get a COVID, which fundamentally changes. Like you're in my house right now, so you're getting a chance to see like my 4-year-old's books, and like my wife's art and stuff like that. That's here. It's like it's a creepy scale, skulls and stuff. Like there's all different ways to be in somebody's space now and be more personal, on a one-to-one basis. So I think like some of that ice has been broken, and that's going to speed up that intelligence, facet. Part of that is like just knowing things. Like you've got the different industries, like the revenue intelligence they're talking about, and conversational intelligence, and all these things that people are talking about, which gives you relevance around that. And then there's all this other element around like, well, how do you do that at a higher scale around that? What we were talking about in the previous, episode, to plug that for you, is like, how do you scale authenticity? And how do you actually continue to drive that as time goes on as well? And there's a vision I have in terms of what that's going to look like in the future, and how what we're doing right now and how we're being a center point of that is such a fundamental, and the most emotional place to actually be, which is a big piece that has to be, evolved inside of business as well. And obviously you've got AR and VR and all these things that are going to totally fundamentally change how people look at shopping. And I'm an e-commerce geek, so like I'm looking very closely at a lot of those trends. Crypto or blockchain, is going to fundamentally change how people are thinking about, things. I mean, NFTs are interesting, but I think that's going to be a interesting evolution as time goes on. That's there. So there's a lot of tech trends, but privacy, control, behavior change, shopping, all that type of stuff is going to be like, a fundamental difference that's there. But in the real world where people have to interact with each other, there's going to be a lot of technology focused on how you actually bring people together.
Bringing people together, that is the future. Thank you so much, Greg. This has been
Thanks, Alex.
Thoroughly enjoyable. Definitely for those that want to hear more about Alyce, go back and listen to part 1 of our discussion on uptechreport.com. You can also head over to alyce.com, ALYCE.com, be able to request a demo and learn more about their platform. Thanks again for your time, Greg. It's great to have you on.
Appreciate it.
And we'll see you guys on the next episode of UpTech Report. Have you seen a company using AI, machine learning, or other technology to transform the way we live, work, and do business? Go to uptechreport.com and let us know.